Hi guys, this is Coach Arnold. I am back with part 3. This is still considered the introduction of African American studies. We are going through those ancient African kingdoms. So this will be the third kingdom that we discussed today. All right. You should have already opened your Cornell notes for the African kingdoms. We're going to add on to that by adding our third kingdom. So if you will, go ahead and draw a little line. And then let's get it titled Nubia. All right, so the third kingdom we're going to talk about is Nubia. Your EQ is going to be similar to all of the ones before, as well as your overall EQ for these African civilizations, which is what is the culture, okay? So first off, we always want to talk about the culture of these different kingdoms. And then when it comes to Nubia, we're going to look at how they were influenced and who they also influenced. All right, so your EQ is what is the culture of Nubia, who were they influenced by, and who did they influence? And if you want to shorthand it, you can say what was the culture and the influences of Nubia. All right, so if you guys remember your Cornell notes on the left-hand side, you will be writing down the title of the slides, if there's any questions on the slide or vocab terms. And then on the right, you're going to pull what you believe is the most important information to help you answer this question. For example, anything that is said more than twice, things that might be underlined, or definitions or answers to those questions that you put on the left side, okay? There is no wrong answer in this class. I am not going to require you to write word for word from this PowerPoint, so just pull out what you believe is the most important, okay? All right, so Nubia is a kingdom that sits slightly south of Egypt. It does sit along the Nile River, and because of that, these two kingdoms are very influenced and intertwined, okay? So Nubia actually gets conquered by Egypt, and then after Egypt gets weakened, it goes back and conquers Egypt and rules during what becomes known as the Kushite dynasty or the 25th dynasty, okay? Because of their access to the Nile River, they do build wide trade routes. On those rivers, they are exporting and sending out ivory, animal skins, gold, perfumes, and slaves. Most of their trading is done with the Kingdom of Egypt that sits north of them, simply because that Nile River flows from south to north. So it was very easy for them to put their goods on there and just to flow up the river into the Kingdom of Egypt. Nubia is also going to be known for producing iron tools and weapons, most famously their bow and arrow. And they are going to develop a system of writing similar to the Egyptians, as well as adopting those Egyptian traditions, especially since they are conquered by Egypt. And then when they conquer Egypt, they kind of fall into that traditional Egyptian culture that was already there. Okay. So Nubia is going to be heavily, heavily influenced by Egypt. There is a heavy influence by Egypt because they conquered each other. All right, so as I was discussing, you guys, this is Nubia. It is south of Upper, Middle, and Lower Egypt. Remember that the river does flow from south to north. They are going to develop trade along this Nile River. In addition to that, they're going to also exchange cultural traits such as religion, architecture, and art. So you'll see a lot of similarities with Egypt in the ancient kingdom of Nubia. For example, your Nubian pyramids, they did build roughly 500 pyramids. Now, these pyramids were a lot smaller and a little bit different than the Egyptian pyramids, but they were still behind the same premise and notion. Burial sites for those who were wealthy or those who had kingdom or elite status of ruling. Okay. Most of these pyramids, unfortunately, do get destroyed when the Nubians fight with the Italians. Some of them are also destroyed when the Egyptians also reconquer themselves. But you do see a lot of pyramids throughout. If you're in Sudan or South Sudan, you do see these pyramids, and these are Nubian with the influence of Egypt. All right, so here's another one. This one was for a Nubian king. And when Nubia had control over Egypt, they commissioned a lot of pyramids to be built by using that slave labor that Egypt had. They did push for it. And of course, they took a lot of that architecture for themselves, and they wanted it to be a little bit different. So they're not as big and not as triangle shaped as Egyptians, if that makes any sense. Like, I'll talk about it later. Okay. But theirs are a little bit smaller and a lot more narrow going up. Okay. All right. So this is what I mean. Like, they're smaller, they're not as wide. The Egyptians' pyramids were very big and long, like full equilateral triangles, whereas these are not. Your Nubians are not equilateral triangles. All right, so they're smaller and they're steeper. Your Nubians are smaller and steeper. Your Egyptian pyramids have big, big blocks to make them, and they're a lot larger. They're typically about 3 times bigger than the Nubians, okay? They are similar because they're used as tombs, and they do have the triangle shape, even though they're different styles and types of triangles, okay? So pyramids, they both have them, Nubia and Egypt. Mainly Egypt is going to start this and influence the Nubians, but they both serve as tombs for those kings, those elite, and the wealthy. All right, so one reason why there is not a lot known about Nubia is because they started their writing system a little bit late. However, they do eventually get their hieroglyphics, and they start to document and record their history. Also, some of their history is recorded in Egyptian hieroglyphics from the time period that the Egyptians had conquered Nubia, and then when the Nubians reconquered themselves and then go on to conquer Egypt as well. They did a great job of recording their history in those hieroglyphics, but the very beginning of their history, unfortunately, is still not fully clear because it's not written down and it was passed down by stories. Okay. Another thing, Nubia is isolated, similar to Egypt, but a little bit more because they are in the desert. Okay, so even though they're along the Nile River, they don't flourish as much as an oasis as Egypt does. Um, and that harsh desert does keep the outsiders, those people, from coming through and reaching Nubia. Okay. All right, but ancient Nubia, it was a great kingdom. You guys, they produced the different resources like gold, ivory, copper, ebony. They're also known as Kush, or the land of the bow. Their most famous weapon was the bow and arrow. This was one of the reasons why they were so successful in war. They did become powerful kings, and they were known for shooting their bow and arrows for long lengths of time, or long distances, excuse me. This is why they're the land of the bow, because during war they would be able to shoot their opponent at a further range than most could. Okay, so most of your Nubian kings and queens were actually buried with their bows and arrows. All right, so as I've said several times, Nubia does get conquered by Egypt. Egypt rules and conquers them for roughly 1,000 years. Eventually, Egypt's ruling does start to weaken. And because of this, Nubia gets its independence, and then they actually conquer the kingdom of Egypt. So at one point in time, Egypt had Nubian pharaohs, and those pharaohs just fell into line in the Egyptian tradition. They did not try to change it too much because the culture was already very similar. And they made sure to record and document as much of that history as they could in the Egyptian hieroglyphics. All right, so Nubia, also known as Kush. Remember the metalworking, the construction, They made pyramids. They had bows and arrows. They do end up getting invaded by Egypt, and then they also go on to invade Egypt back. Okay. And this is where we are going to stop. So next time we will get into part 4 of African ancient kingdoms, and we will continue on this journey of learning about these kingdoms that are often untalked about in your history classes. Until next time, have a great one.